Well, I've been given the honor of introducing our guest speaker tonight, and it's a special honor for me because I've met, as many of you know, Hoot is my brother, and our mother, Rita Gibson, is here with us. And several other family members that, oh, Rita, please stand up. Several other family members, and we all couldn't be more proud of Hoot and love having a chance to bring him here on behalf of the Monrovia Management Association and share his adventures with all of you. We have a wonderful crowd tonight, and we couldn't be more thrilled about that. With that, I'd like to bring on NASA astronaut and Navy Captain Robert Hoot Gibson.
She's so young and cute looking, you'd never know she's going to be a grandmother. I guess at some point I'm going to have to face up to that, but not just yet. Patty, thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here tonight to have a chance to talk to you all again. I guess 2 years ago we did this, and I had a couple of things to tell you about that night. I think I have something else to tell you about this evening, and it's a pleasure to have so many different parts of McDonnell Douglas here tonight. I have a message that I take everywhere I go, and that's that there are a very few number of us that actually get to be the ones to fly aboard the shuttle when we go up to orbit. But none of us are blind to the fact that there are a great many people that support us and help us get launched and help us get to orbit. McDonnell Douglas has a very big role in the space shuttle operation and in the things that we do right now and the things that we will do in the future. So thank you very much for everything that you do. And like I say, I like to pay tribute to the number of people that it takes to actually get a space shuttle launched and get a mission pulled together. This particular flight that I'm going to tell you about tonight was a very exciting mission for me. It was one that I originally didn't want to be part of. I was the chief astronaut starting in late 1992, and as such I was running the astronaut corps and I was making all the flight assignments. And this was one of the biggest flights to come along in the last 10 or 20 years, and so number one, I wouldn't dare take it for myself, being the chief, or I'd be run out of town on a rail, I'm sure. But number two, I had a number of very talented commanders and very sharp folks that I thought would do very, very well on that flight, so I put together a pretty good crew. NASA didn't like it. They took everybody that I put on the crew except for me. They forced me to go do it, so I had to step down as chief astronaut. And they made me go fly again. This was a fifth flight for me. I had previously flown aboard the Space Shuttles Challenger, Columbia, Atlantis, and Endeavour. So they messed up all my planning because I was planning on going out on the Space Shuttle Discovery, and I'd be the first person to have flown all 5 space shuttles. And they forced me into taking this one, and I went out, and now I've flown Atlantis twice instead of flying Discovery once. My wife, though, has flown Discovery. I'm married to another astronaut, Ray Seddon, and she has flown 3 times in space. She flew Discovery on her first flight, and she flew Columbia on her second 2 flights. This flight that I'm going to talk to you about tonight, I'm sure many of you saw it happen, and many of you realize it caught a lot of press coverage, which we have been becoming aware of since we got back down from the mission, was the first docking flight with the Russian space station Mir. And this is part of the International Space Station program, and it's what we're referring to as Phase 1 of the International Space Station. We're going to send 7 to 10 space shuttle flights up to dock with the Russian Mir over the next 2 to 3 years, probably 7 and not 10 of them. And then Phase 2 will actually begin where we start assembling the International Space Station, and I know McDonnell Douglas is playing a big role in that, and we're grateful to have you on board and happy to have you helping us. We have brought the Russians on board as an international partner. One of the things that we need to work out is how we're going to work the two mission control centers together. And if there was a big challenge on this flight, it probably wasn't the physical docking of the space shuttle to the Mir, which is what I got to perform, my crew and I got to perform. The real challenge on this flight was probably how do we pull together two completely separate and distinct space programs that are standing on their own and are functioning very nicely, all by themselves, thank you. They don't need each other to function, and yet all of a sudden now we've got to pull the two of them together and make them work together and move to the same direction and move to the same goal. We don't even speak the same language, and I've been studying Russian for about 1.5 years now, and I don't speak Russian very well, and I think it takes a lot of time to learn how to speak that language. The only revenge we get on the Russians is that English is just as difficult to learn from their point of view as Russian is for us. So we get even with them a little bit, I guess, on that regard. But the real challenge, I think, on this flight was pulling together the coordination that had to happen on the ground to make these two programs be able to fly together and to pull together. So I'm going to show you some images. I have about a 16-minute video that we put together that I'll narrate to show you what the flight looked like. But because the video moves kind of quick, I'm going to be a little bit redundant, and I'd like to run through a set of slides and show you what it looked like from the perspective of the still imagery, and then we'll take a look at the video, and I think you'll have a pretty good understanding for the things that we actually got to do on this flight. And I would mention that this flight looks very much like the sort of things that we're going to have to do with the International Space Station. We're going to launch what we believe will be a multinational crew on board a shuttle, fly it up to an International Space Station, dock it with the station, transfer equipment and people to and from the space station, and bring them back down and land. And I think the fact that the flight came off as well as it did, that it was as successful as it was, is a real good precursor for the things that we hope to do with the International Space Station. So with that, if someone can reach the slide projector, and somebody back there gets to be my official slide projector operator, if you would. I mentioned international crews. We had an international crew on this particular flight, and you might fool with the focus just a little bit if you would. We had an international crew on this flight, and I was one of 3 commanders that launched on this mission, because we actually integrated 3 separate crews together. We had 2 Russians and an American that made up the crew of Mir 18, and that was Vladimir Dezhurov and Gennady Strikalov and Norm Thagard. And they are the 3 to the far left of the picture, the 2 on the far left standing up, and the 1 on the far left seated in the front. And then we had the crew of Atlantis, which was the STS-71 crew, and that was 5 of us. And that's the middle 4 in the background, and myself in the foreground, of course, as the commander of Atlantis. And then we had the crew of Mir 19, that was Anatoly Solovyev, who's seated right on my left in the foreground, and then Nikolai Budarin, who's at the far right in this picture. So this was an interesting mission. It's the first time that we have launched and landed with a different number of people on board the space shuttle, and it's the first time we've ever had 10 people together in one spacecraft. Next slide. We had a crew patch that was designed by famous aviation artist Bob McCall, who's out of Phoenix, Arizona, and he designed us a crew emblem that shows the merging of the 2 programs coming together on the one patch, the Mir program and the Atlantis. And one of the hardest things about Russian is learning how to read the darn alphabet. So, you know, reading the names on the outside that's about as much as I've learned to do in 1.5 years. Next one. I think Pat kind of referred to it. We went down to the Cape to launch. I guess originally we were shooting at June the 22nd or June the 23rd. They all kind of blend together in the rain. But we finally managed to lift off on June the 27th at about 3:30 in the afternoon. And the whole entire launch was aimed to rendezvous with the Mir. So we had a very small window in the sky that we had to launch within. We had to launch within a 5-minute window because we had to launch while the Mir was in plane, so that we were underneath the Mir's flight path, essentially, at the launch site down at Cape Canaveral. So that gave us only 5 minutes in which we could launch. And everything worked very nicely on June the 27th, and off we went. Next one. We were delivering these two to orbit. These are the two Russians that got to looking very much like Americans, because we had them in the States for about 5 weeks, training them on the shuttle before we went up there. But they are still up there today. We dropped them off on June the 29th was the day that we rendezvoused with the Mir. And we left on July the 4th, left the Mir, and came back down and landed on July the 7th. And they won't come down for about another week now. They just launched a Soyuz up there to relieve them, and they'll be coming down here in a week. My crew and I are going to be going to Russia, I think the week after next, to shake their hands and welcome them back to Earth. So that's Nikolai Budarin again and Anatoly Solovyev. Next one. We had to perform a whole number of burns over the next couple of days, and what we do essentially is we vary the height of our orbit, and that's how we catch up with them. When we want to catch somebody in space, we launch behind them, and then we launch into a lower altitude orbit, which puts us going a shorter distance around the Earth, and so we catch up with them at a rate depending on what the altitude difference is between our two spacecraft. So we did a number of burns with the orbiter's engines, adjusting our altitude up and down, well, never down, always up, to arrange the timing so that we caught them at precisely the right time. And this was one of the burns going on, but the point was, over the first day and a half of the mission, we did a number of burns to phase with the Mir Space Station. Next one. Once we got in relatively close, we started using a bunch of our onboard sensors. We had a radar on board, we had a device called a star tracker, which ordinarily tracks stars, and we used it to track the Mir Space Station. Let's see if I can get it. We used it to track the Mir Space Station when we got close enough, and then as we got inside of about half a mile, we had a handheld laser, which is what the Highway Patrol uses on us, I guess, nowadays to see how fast we're moving. But we had a handheld laser, and you can see my flight engineer, Greg Harbaugh, pointing this handheld laser out the window. The flight deck was a very, very busy place during the course of the rendezvous because we manually control the orbiter in the course of the rendezvous. The Russians have a fully automatic system for rendezvous. We have a fully manual system. So I was physically flying the orbiter from the back of the cockpit and flying the burns and the thruster inputs to actually place our flight path up and coincident with the Mir. Next one. Simultaneously, we had Dr. Bonnie Dunbar talking on a VHF radio in Russian, and she's relatively fluent in Russian, and she was communicating directly with the Mir Space Station to make sure that they knew how far away we were, what our closure rate was, and they were real nervous about our closure rate since we fly a manual rendezvous, and they fly an automatic one. They always wanted to know exactly what it was, because it turns out they were bumped into kind of hard during the Apollo-Soyuz docking back in 1975, and they've never forgotten it since then. And they didn't want to be bumped into rather abruptly with this flight, so they were real nervous about how far away are you and what's your closure rate. So we were constantly passing that to them. Next one. This was one of our earlier views of the Mir as we closed on it, and the Mir was about the same size we were. The space shuttle weighed 233,000 pounds, I'm sorry, 235,000 pounds when I docked with them, and the Mir Space Station was on the order of about 235,000 pounds as well. So we made together almost a 500,000 pound vehicle when we finally docked. And again, this was one of the first views that we saw, and at this point our range is probably about 3/4 of a mile away. Next one. They were taking pictures of us as well, and this is a view that Norm shot from on board the Mir, and he's looking down at us. We were flying a rendezvous that we call an R-bar, and R-bar stands for radius, well, it's not an exact abbreviation, but we have two kind of rendezvous. One's a V-bar, and that's on the velocity vector, and we have an R-bar, which is on the radius vector. So we were on the radius vector below the Mir, and it's the radius vector from the Mir to the center of the Earth. So if you look down from the Mir, we're directly underneath them as we're coming up. And you can see that this is a picture taken over the Aral Sea over in Kazakhstan. And what I'm going to actually physically do is fly this docking mechanism, this little docking ring right here out in the cargo bay, up to and into contact with a similar docking ring on the Mir Space Station. And I have a set of thrusters on the orbiter so that I can move it fore and aft, up and down. And as I say, we're manually flying the thing to make it come up and dock with the Mir. Next one. This is a view a little bit closer in. The whole entire procedure took, from the time we got to about 1,000 feet away till docking, took us on the order of about 3 hours. So it was a very slow, gradual process because we didn't want to hurry on up there and bang into them with an excessive rate. So it was a very, very slow process. Next one. This was another view of the Mir as we got closer, and you can see a little bit better look at the docking ring. And at the center of it, you can see a little white cross, and that white cross was something that we had to point our TV camera at, and our TV camera was mounted at the very center of our docking mechanism, and that was the bullseye. So I could look on the TV camera in the shuttle, and I could see within inches of whether I was lined up. And we had to be lined up very precisely. I had to line up Atlantis within plus and minus 3 inches of the center of that docking mechanism. So we needed a pretty good bullseye to see if we were within that tolerance. Next one. Another view as we got closer. We had built-in holds. We held for an hour at 270 feet away on the approach, and then we closed in to 30 feet away, and at 30 feet away, we had to evaluate the relative attitudes of the two vehicles. And so what I did was we would look at our TV camera on the orbiter, and we would see if it looked nice and square. In other words, the attitude of our shuttle relative to the Mir's attitude. Because the Mir is determining its orientation with respect to the Earth. We're independently determining our orientation, and we had to dock within plus and minus 2 degrees in all 3 axes. So if we had an error, if one of us was off by 2 degrees, then we'd be outside of our allowable error tolerance. So what we did was we would maneuver the orbiter to take up that other 2 degrees so that the 2 docking rings would exactly line up. So we evaluated that at 30 feet, and we called it 3/10 of a degree, 3/10 of a degree, and 0. And that's exactly what it was. So we had a pretty good system for evaluating the misalignment, and there was hardly any, so we didn't have to do very much with it. Next one. While we were maneuvering in, we were able to wave to the 2 Russians and to Normie on board the Mir, and the 2 Russians are waving at us out this big window up here, and Norm Thaggart is on this little window here. And we were able to take each other's picture through the glass and wave and say hi. I had always thought, well, when we get to about 30 feet away, we'll negotiate the price for picking him up. But we forgot all about it. We got so excited about what we were doing, we forgot to negotiate the price. Next one. And finally, we actually did dock. And I have a nice sequence in the video that we'll get to see that shows the actual moment of docking. Because these vehicles are both so heavy and so massive, we had to dock at a very slow rate. We had to dock at 1/10 of a foot per second, which is 1.2 inches per second. And you'll see in the video it's a very, very slow docking rate. And they had a lot of leeway. They gave me a lot of leeway on it. They wanted us to dock at 0.1 feet per second, plus or minus 0.03 feet per second. So I could be anywhere between 0.07 and 0.13 and everything would be fine. Next one. And I think probably many of you have seen this picture. This was an electronic still photograph that we shot on orbit, and we beamed it down the very same day. And this was the first international space docking that we've had in 20 years since the Apollo-Soyuz docking in 1975. And as the commander of Atlantis, I had the honor of reaching across and shaking hands with Vladimir Dezhurov. And they had been up at that point about 108 days, I guess. And they were starting to think about sea breezes and being back down on solid land again. He had actually joked with us before the flight. He said, when you get up there and you're ready to open the hatch, I want you to wipe down the seals on your side of the hatch with cognac, and if I smell cognac, I'll open the hatch. As it was, after 108 days, he was happy enough to see us. He opened the hatch anyway. Next one. And we went over into the Mir Space Station right after we got the hatch open, and we had a welcome ceremony. And this is Gennady Strikalov. He had to stay back in the Mir core module while we all were out at the hatch doing all of our ceremonies out there, because he had to listen for the radio for Moscow to call in case they needed something. So we went into the Mir core module and greeted him, and you'll see that in the video too. Next one. This is Charlie Precourt, my co-pilot, and he's working his way through one of the modules on board the Mir Space Station. People ask me, well, what did the Mir look like? Well, this is one picture of what the Mir looked like. It is kind of cluttered. And the interesting thing was, before we came up there, they cleaned it up because they didn't want us to see it all messy. It's been up there since 1986, so the Mir has been on orbit for 9 years now. And one of the things that they didn't design into it was stowage lockers. They didn't build any stowage into it. So as a result, they've got suitcases stuck to the wall. They've got scientific equipment. They've got cables. They've got air cooling ducts running along the ceiling. I don't want to get started, but anyway, the place looks a little bit cluttered when you see it. And again, we were seeing it in a very cleaned up state. So we said it kind of looks like working in a cave, in a very cluttered cave. And this is Charlie working his way through the Crystal module. Next one. This is another one of the areas that they cleaned up for us before we got there. This is the Mir base block, or the core module. And this is where they do virtually all of their controlling from, and this is where they spend the majority of their time. Just out of sight in the foreground right here is their dining room table, or their wardroom table, where they spend a lot of their time and where they eat all their meals. And they're at the control station in the Mir. One of the interesting things about the Mir, when they train before flight, if you would have a leak on board the station, they train for how you close all the hatches, isolate the different modules, how you make your way to the Soyuz capsule, figure out where the leak is, and thereby isolate the leaking module. If you look in the background of the picture, you'll see 3 or 4 air ducts that go through the hatch. You'll see a whole bunch of cables that go through the hatch. You'll see an awful lot of things that go through there. There is no way that you're going to close any hatches on board this Mir Space Station. So you're going to make your way to the Soyuz, and you're going to undock and leave the station. Is the only thing you can do in a real cabin leak. Nevertheless, today they train all their cosmonauts how to isolate the different modules and how to retreat all the way down to the Soyuz, closing the doors behind you as you go. But it's not going to be a very easy thing to do. Next one. It's kind of hard to get one photo that shows what this thing looked like when we were up there docked to it. It was a pretty spectacular image to look out the window and see the Mir as we were closing in on it, because it's even bigger than we are. The shuttle, as you probably know, is about the size of a DC-9 in terms of length. It's about 129 feet long. The Mir is over 180 feet from one end to the other. And one of the things we could do is we could put a wide-angle lens on the camera, and we could shoot, in this case, the aft flight deck on the orbiter and try and shoot out all the windows and see what it looked like. The next photo is a picture out the upper window. Next one is a view out the overhead window, and we're able to see the Crystal module, and then the node, a couple of the large solar arrays, the Cavant 2 sticking out on this side. On the other side, where we can't see it, is the Mir base block, the Cavant 1, the Soyuz. We can't see the Spectre because the Spectre is sticking down the other way. It's just a massive, big station that's up there in orbit. And this is a wide-angle photograph, and even so, we just don't really do it justice. Next one. This is kind of a traditional photo that folks do. They'll make a starburst and put everybody together, although this is the first time we've had 10 people in one space vehicle before, and this is, of course, the largest space vehicle at nearly 500,000 pounds that we have ever put together. And again, 2 of those 10 are still up there. So we had a really interesting flight where we launched with 7 people, and we came down with 8 people. So we made people on orbit. Got an extra one. Next one. Well, one of the very important things that we were up there to do on this particular flight was performed back in the space lab. And this is a view back in the laboratory, and you'll see this in the video as well. We wanted to find out what sort of effects we could see in the people who have spent more than 100 days up there in orbit. The Russians, although they have had cosmonauts up for 440 days, they really don't have a lot of medical data on them. So we ask them questions like, how much bone calcium did they lose? They say they don't know. We ask them what was their blood chemistry like? They say they didn't measure it. What they do is they send somebody up and keep them up for 90 days, and if he lives, then they go for 120, and if he lives, they go for 180, and that's kind of how they've built it up. And one of the interesting results that we found out from Norm when he got back down is that the bone calcium loss is a lot worse than we thought it was, and we thought it was pretty bad. As you probably know, all of us standing here against gravity or having to support our weight against gravity, and the large bones in your legs and the large bones in your body are what gives you enough rigidity and enough strength to support your weight against gravity. When you get up into orbit, you don't have any weight on your bones, and the body says, well, I don't need all this calcium, I don't need all this bone mass, let's start getting rid of it. So our old formula was that you would lose 1.5% to 2% of your bone calcium per month. Norm was up almost 4 months, but he lost 11% of his bone calcium out of his large weight-bearing bones in his leg. And the specific bone we measured was his femur. So we wanted to see a number of things on this flight. We wanted to see what kind of condition is the human body in weightlessness at the end of 100 days. And then we brought them back down to Earth and we measured them again on the Earth to see what kind of changes and how the adaptation works when we actually get back down on Earth. So we ran a lot of studies up in space on a bicycle ergometer, which is what Vladimir is riding. We also had a treadmill. We did a lot of blood work, urine work, saliva samples and things from the guys that had been up there over 100 days to see what kind of things, what kind of changes happen in the human body in that kind of time and weightlessness. So we were very busy doing a lot of medical research while we were up there. Next one. We also had to change out some of the machinery. This was that little white cross that I mentioned. I don't know where that cross is. I want to find that thing because I want to keep it. But one of the things we had to change out on the Mir was the docking target, and that's the docking target that I have in my hand. We took it off the hatch from the crystal, which is where it sits outside of the station when nobody's there, and we had a new docking target that we put on because our design was not the best design, so we came up with a better one, but of course nobody could get near it because it was on the outside of the space station. So once we docked, we took that target off and we put a new target on that I'll show you in just a second here. Next one. We transferred a great number of things, and I'll refer to that real briefly as the video is running too, but we transferred more than 250 items from the shuttle to the Mir, and over 200 items from the Mir back to the shuttle during the course of the time that we were docked with them, which was 5 days. We were docked to the Mir with the hatches open for a full 5 days. One of the other things that we did was we gave them water. And water doesn't sound, we should have sold them water. Water doesn't sound like a real big deal, but humans need water every day. And the Russians don't make water the way that we do in orbit. We make water because we generate electricity by combining hydrogen with oxygen in a device called a fuel cell. That generates electricity for us, and the byproduct is water. So we make water, and we dump about 200 pounds of water a day because we burn about 9 or 10 kilowatts the whole time that we're up in orbit. So we produce a lot of water. We drink a lot of it, and we use it for cooling on the orbiter, but we also dump about 200 pounds a day. So we gave the Russians almost 1,100 pounds of water in the 5 days that we were docked to them. And we did it 1 bucket at a time. And this is Greg filling one of the Russian buckets from a supply hose on the orbiter. So you just see him running back and forth. He said after this flight we're going to change his name to Gunga Din. But all the time during the dock phase of the flight, he was hauling water buckets back and forth from the Mir to the shuttle. Next one. A couple pretty pictures. We had the opportunity to go over onto the Mir, and this is a photo shot from the Cavant 2 module, looking over the nose of the shuttle, and in the background, up on the top left-hand side of the picture, is Turkey, the large landmass that you can kind of see up there. Up on the top of the photo in the very center is the Straits of the Bosporus, and Istanbul would be under the clouds. This is the Crimean Peninsula over here on this side, and this is the Dnieper River coming in. Kind of a pretty view that we get there from orbit. Here's another view. The next one is a slide with a little bit bigger lens, and that's our hero looking out the top right-hand window. I've got the sun in my face, so you can't hardly stand to keep your eyes open for more than just a second or two, but we got one picture of, I think we shot everybody, is what we did in that window. Next one. We had kind of a pretty view up there. This is another view from in the Russian space station, and this is in the Kristall module, which is in the docking mechanism, and this is looking aft, and you can see the space lab that I've been referring to back in the cargo bay. And of course, you know, the space lab is a large pressurized volume that we can carry back in the back of the orbiter, and it about doubles our pressurized volume that we have to work in, and we can use it for materials science or for life science, which we were using it for on this flight. Next one. Just a couple pretty pictures here. We didn't have a whole lot of time for looking at the Earth, but we did manage to shoot a couple pictures. This is a wide-angle view of the California coast, and you can see the Los Angeles area just shows up as the kind of the silver area down there in the lower left-hand side of the picture, and you can see the Central Valley. Central Valley shows up real well in the middle of the picture. And of course our coastal fog that hangs around off the coast and moves in the night and back out in the daytime shows up very clearly from space, and it's pretty wide. Next one. Kind of a pretty picture we shot of the Andes. Of course it was summer in the northern hemisphere, so it was winter in the southern hemisphere, so this is a shot of the Andes in the wintertime. Next one. Pat, here's a picture for you. Nice shot of Cape Cod. My co-pilot, Charlie Precourt, was from, let's see, what's in Hudson, Maine? He's from Hudson. So, of course, he wanted us to show this picture in our post-flight press conference, because I guess Hudson is somewhere in that picture. So we did. Next one. This was kind of an interesting photo. The very next flight was going to go try and conduct an experiment called MASTS, which was, I don't remember what it stood for, but essentially it was look for ships under clouds. And this is cold water north of Japan. This is up by the Kuril Islands, north of Japan. And we have some relatively cold water and some cold water clouds that form above it. And when a ship drives along the surface under it, the extra heat that the ship's stacks put out will cause changes in the clouds, and you can look down at the clouds and see where the ships are under there. And some people, like the United States Navy, find that sort of thing interesting. It's nice to be able to see where ships are when they're hiding under clouds. And some of them will show you where they are, like this one. Next one. Well, we spent, as I mentioned, 5 days docked to the Mir, and at the end of that time, we were going to do something kind of interesting, and it's kind of interesting that this ever got approved, because the Russians wanted to take video of us undocking, of the shuttle undocking from the Mir. And the only problem is, you've got to be off to the side to be able to see that. And they said, hey, no problem, we'll just undock the Soyuz, we'll fly off to the side in our little Soyuz, the shuttle can undock, there'll be nobody on the space station. And so we said, we told Houston, well, we're going to let them undock, and then we'll claim the station for our own. And they said, we'll say they abandoned it, and it's ours now. So, but we didn't do that. But anyway, the day before undocking, this whole plan got approved, by the way, before we launched. So the idea was the Soyuz would undock, they would take still photography and video of us undocking, and then share it with us, and they'd have some spectacular imagery. And I'll show you what that looked like in the video in just a second here. But the day before, Anatoly and Nikolai climbed into the Soyuz, and they went through all their control systems, and they went through all the electronics and all the mechanisms on board to make sure that the Soyuz was still working well. It had launched on March the 14th of this year, and it had been up ever since. And we undocked on July the 4th, so this is July the 3rd, and they're checking out the Soyuz just to make sure everything works okay. The next slide is a picture of Nikolai with his two friends. They also had to check out their spacesuits and make sure everything worked okay, because they climb into their suits anytime they're in the Soyuz, just in case they lose pressure or have any kind of a leak or whatever. So they also had to check out their suits the day before. And the next one, was the final ceremony that we had in the Mir core module. Again, this was the night before undocking, and this was what we called the farewell ceremony. During the course of the time that Anatoly had been in Houston, he had gotten to be a real fan of the world champion Houston Rockets. And so one of the presents that I had for him right before we left him was a Houston Rockets t-shirt, and that's what he's got on in this picture here. And this is in the Mir base block module where we had our final ceremony of the flight. And then the next slide, we left the Mir and we closed the crew hatch, and that's the new target that we put on. You can see that we had the old white and black target that we took off. This is a better design, and that's the new target on the hatch. And that hatch again is on the outside of the Mir once we undock. So this is an area called the vestibule, which is right between the two vehicles. Next one. Meanwhile, while we were asleep that night, Mission Control Moscow and Mission Control Houston completely rewrote the undocking plan, and the next morning this little piece of paper was the new undocking plan that they sent us up about 2 hours before we had to fly it. And one of the things they sent up was, they said, well, we know you've trained on this very thoroughly, and one of the things that we did, we were going to undock and we were going to fly all the way around the space station 1.5 times. And that was so that we could photograph it from all different angles, get a picture of the Soyuz redocking when they went back in and redocked on the station, but also get photography of all the different portions of the station as we flew around it. Well, they came to us that morning and said, we've changed it just a little bit. We want you to fly the whole thing backwards. And we had trained to do it a whole bunch of different ways, but not backwards. We had never trained to do it backwards. But nevertheless, that morning, we flew it backwards, and it worked out just fine. Next one. And then Anatoly and Nikolai, 15 minutes before we undocked, they undocked and moved out of plane and off to the side about 65 meters. And this is a view of them flying their little Soyuz capsule. And it has two different portions. It has the re-entry capsule is this forward part, and that's the only part that comes back down to the ground. And then they have another part, the habitation module, that has the solar arrays on it, is the back half of the Soyuz, and they fly the whole thing around when they maneuver around. As I recall, it weighs about 10 tons, as I recall, is the weight of the whole thing. So they flew that again off to the side about 65 meters. And Anatoly, this was his 4th space flight, so he's a very experienced cosmonaut. He did a beautiful job of holding station with the thing while we were getting ready to undock. Next one. And then we undocked. And in the course of maneuvering out and flying away from the station, we were able to catch this picture of it. And it's such a big, expansive thing that it's hard to see it all. But this was the Mir base block, or the core module. This little tinker toy up here was a structural node. This was the Kavant 1 module. This is the Soyuz, redocked to the end of the station. This was the Spectre module, down on this part. The Kavant 2 is on the upper part. You might tweak the focus just a little bit on that. I think it's just a hair out here. The Kavant 2 is the module up there, and the Crystal is the module sticking out on the back side, and that's the module that we were attached to. So we were attached to the far side as we're looking at it here. Next one. And again, we continued to fly around it for 1.5 revolutions backwards. And got a few more pictures of it as we were separating away. Next one. This is a view over the rainforest of Argentina as we're moving away from the Mir. Next one. Okay, we're just about to the end. Now, we actually spent another 2 days on orbit doing some more testing and some more reconfiguring of the orbiter, getting ready to come back down and land. And then we came back down and landed at 10:55 in the morning at Cape Canaveral on the Kennedy main runway. And you'll see that real quickly in the video because we were focusing more on the actual mission itself. And I think there's one more slide as we're rolling out on the runway. And of course, you know, we have a 40-foot diameter drag parachute that we use now to help us get stopped on the runway. And that's a big help because we touched down at about 210 miles an hour. And we weighed 229,000 pounds, I think, was our weight when we came back down and landed. So we can use the help getting stopped. And that's what that's what the flight looked like. And let's see if I can get some help turning on the monitors now. We'll go ahead and run the video and I can show you what that looked like. And we can kill the slides if you would. Okay, I mentioned that we had a 7-member crew to launch, and this is Charlie Precourt on the right, Nikolai Budarin, who was the flight engineer of the Mir 18 crew, Anatoly Solovyev, the commander of the Mir 19, who's still up there and due to come down in about another week or so, Dr. Ellen Baker, who was my payload commander on the flight, Dr. Bonnie Dunbar, and Greg Harbaugh on the far left, who was the flight engineer, Atlantis' flight engineer. We walked out just a little bit after noon on June the 27th, after 2 delays. We had a delay one day when we never even tanked the vehicle because the weather was too bad. This is 2 minutes before liftoff. I didn't even know they had that camera on the launch pad keeping an eye on me, looking in the window to see what we were doing. 2 minutes before liftoff when we close our visors. Here comes the main engines. About 6 seconds before liftoff, and then the solid rocket motors go, and it's too late to change your mind. And again, we're phasing on the Mir Space Station. Even at this point, the launch was designed to coincide exactly with the opportunity to launch and rendezvous up with the Mir. And then again, we adjust the altitude of the orbit. And initially, we launched into the lowest orbit that any space shuttle has ever flown in. We went to an orbit that was 160 miles high on the high point, which is normal, but down to 85 miles at the low point. So we flew the lowest orbit that's been flown by a shuttle. The docking mechanism is in the left side of that picture with the black dots on it, and those are for photography purposes. We had a lot of work to do the day after we launched, and we spent the whole entire flight day 2 reconfiguring the orbiter, hooking up a whole bunch of laptop computers that we used to help us with the laser sensors and all those things. And I mentioned that the aft flight deck was a very, very busy place during the rendezvous, and you'll get some feel for it in some of the video. We had all 5 members of the crew very actively involved and very busy with operating the different computers, the lasers, the radar, the orbiter's computers. And the Mir, as you can see in these pictures, is kind of a big cluttered looking thing, and as you're closing in on it, you wonder how you're going to find your way in between all those arrays and things that are sticking out, but nevertheless it can be done. Initially the Mir was not in the correct attitude, not in the attitude that we needed to dock with, and we had to stay outside of 270 feet until it was in the correct attitude. And so that's one of the purposes for the hold we did out at 270. You can see we're actually flying from the aft part of the orbiter and looking out the overhead windows. And I have controls back there to fly the orbiter, an orbiter control stick, as well as an orbiter throttle, if you will, a translation controller that fires all the thrusters. Here's the Mir maneuvering to attitude. And this actual video is speeded up a little bit because the actual maneuver rate is very, very slow. You can see in the middle of the picture again the docking ring, the circular ring that we're going to physically dock Atlantis with. And this is another view, some video that Norm was shooting from the Mir as we were coming up. Here's a little bit closer. This is probably on the order of about 200 feet as we're moving in. You can see that little white cross at the very center of the ring. Here we are now, we're inside of about 10 feet, and you can see what 1/10 of a foot per second looks like. It's a very, very slow maneuver rate, and here comes the actual docking. Atlantis is the ring on the bottom of the picture, and I'm flying Atlantis up to dock it with the Mir. I mentioned that I had to shoot at 0.1 feet per second. The actual rate was 0.107 feet per second, so I missed it. And there's the actual moment of contact, and you can see some dynamics. You can see some springing going on back and forth as these two 200,000-pound vehicles come together. On the right side of that picture is that centerline camera that I referred to that we had for me to refer to get the lineup exactly right. It took us about an hour and a half after we finally got docked to finish all the pressure checks and all the reconfiguration that we had to do to go ahead and open the hatches. And you could see Vladimir Dezhurov over on the other side of the final hatch. And finally everything is ready. Mission control on both sides, Moscow and Houston, has said go ahead, we're ready. And I opened the final hatch and floated across and shook hands with the commander of the Mir-18, Vladimir Dezhurov. NASA's estimate was that we had 1 billion people watching on TV when we did this. We had to negotiate exactly where we were going to shake hands. Here's a view on a camera from his side, and only when everything was all ready and we were in precisely the right location did we reach across and shake hands and say hi. I had learned enough Russian to be able to say welcome to space or something like that when I saw Volodya. And then we had a very brief greeting at the hatch, and you can see quite a few cameras going off. And then we went from the docking module, from the actual interface between the two vehicles, over into the Mir Space Station. And you can see we had a little bit of gear that we had to bring along with us. There were no communication systems that we could use over on the Mir to talk to Houston, so we had a speaker microphone box that would give us audio from the ground and a little microphone that we could talk on, and it was on the end of a 115-foot cable. But that let us take it with us all the way into the Mir core module. So this is us stringing our wires and going into the Mir core module. Ellen was running the video camera while we were on our way there, and she just left the camera running, so we caught some imagery of us floating through all these dark caves on our way to the Mir core module. And this is the slide that we saw in the Mir core. And again, you can see all those air ducts and cables and things fastened to the wall and taped to the wall and bungeed to the wall all over the Mir Space Station.
A little cable like at home, right?
That's right. And Bonnie Dunbar stuck one of our crew patches up on the wall. I'm not sure if the Russians asked Mission Control if that was okay, but we did it anyway. And right after that, they had us all sign the panel around that sticker. The next day, we had what was called a gift exchange ceremony, and in that gift exchange ceremony, we joined together a model of the Mir and a model of the shuttle. And you can see it tumbling end over end. Our attitude control was obviously a lot better. Norm took his Russian friends, who had been up there with him in space, for a tour of the shuttle, and this is Gennady Strikalov sitting in the commander's seat. Norm took them all over the shuttle, and Charlie Precourt helped show him the aft station, and this is the control panel for the docking mechanism that we actually use to work the hooks and the pressurization and the things to bring those two together. And we took them back and showed them the space lab. And this is some of the activity back in the space lab during the dock phase of the flight. And let's see, we're seeing, I think it's Norm Thagard is really heavily wired. He's being measured how much oxygen he's breathing, how much carbon dioxide he's giving off, and how much actual work he's doing. We're drawing blood from everybody, all the guys that were up there for 100 days. I wanted to have blood drawn, but I was only up for 10 days and they weren't interested in my blood, so I didn't get much blood drawn. But Gennady Strikalov, we find that the cosmonauts and the folks that have been up there in orbit for a long time have a pretty low, it's kind of a low-grade anemia. Norm, when he launched, his blood, I think it was a red blood count, was at 45. And when we got him up on orbit, it was down to 37. So you have a mild form of anemia that you get when you're up on orbit. And that recovers when you get back down, but nevertheless, the changes that we saw were kind of significant. This is Vladimir Dezhurov, again, doing the same sort of thing that Norm had done earlier, and that's riding on the bicycle ergometer. We also had a device called lower body negative pressure, and that's one of the things that we think may help precondition you to come back down to gravity again. It essentially pulls a vacuum, a semi-vacuum on the lower part of your body. That causes blood to be pulled down into your lower body which acts kind of like gravity, pulling blood down into your legs. And that makes your heart work a little bit harder, and it's kind of like stressing you, pre-stressing you for being back on the Earth again. Charlie Precourt was running on the treadmill. I'd said a word or two earlier about the transfers, and in the video, this is where we were transferring one of the items that we carried over to the Mir. And this is a liquid nitrogen freezer that has a bunch of protein crystal growth experiments in it that we transferred over to the Mir. That'll stay there for about 3 months, and then I think it comes down in September. Back in the back of this picture, you can see Charlie Precourt has a few little bags of things that he's having to move from the space lab up to the shuttle, and those came from the Mir. So we were real busy moving things around during the time that we were up there. We had a ham radio, and we get to talk to people around the world. I talked to this nice lady in Australia from on board the Russian Mir Space Station, and she was speaking in Russian. She spoke very, very nice Russian, and we answered her in English and confused the daylights out of her. And I don't have a license, but 2 of the people on the crew have a ham radio license, so they were able to cover for me. Again, this was Anatoly. He was real excited about getting his Houston Rockets t-shirt because, again, he was a real fan of the Rockets. We closed the hatch, as I mentioned, the night before we undocked, and Anatoly and Nick, well, this is one of the views of Anatoly waving to us with a tortilla. We did bring them a bunch of our kind of food. They have a lot of jellied fish and stuff that they eat up on their station, and we brought them some real food, tortillas and things like that. We're approaching shuttle undocking now, and if you look in about the very center of the picture, you can see Anatoly flying the Soyuz out to the left of the space station. And again, he did just a beautiful job flying the thing, and we're about 15 minutes away from undocking the shuttle. He flew it out again 65 meters to the side, and you can see the Soyuz moving smartly by the Mir Space Station and heading our way and out to the side. 65 meters is about 190 feet. That sounds like a long, long ways. He looked real close when I looked at him out the window. And you'll see in some of this imagery his attitude jets, his little thrusters firing to control his translation as well as his location. Right in here you're going to see some jets firing. And we have the same thing on the shuttle, only we have very big jets. We have 900-pound thrust jets that fire and control our attitude and control our translation. I mentioned that he was up there to take some video of us. We have a preliminary copy that we're going to see in just a second here. And here we are approaching the undocking. And again, we had a countdown right down to the actual moment. And we had 12 large structural hooks that were driven by electric motors that released and turned us loose. And here's the actual moment of undocking. And then I had to fly Atlantis down below and away from the Mir out to a range of about 700 feet. And here's the video, I think in just a second here, that Anatoly and Nikolai shot from the Soyuz. This is some of the actual video. It looks like a bunch of models, but that's the actual video that they shot of the shuttle separating from the Mir. And I think there were some transmission errors when they sent it to the ground, so the video isn't real clean, and we're hoping to get some better stuff when they come back down and land. That's Vladimir waving goodbye. He doesn't look unhappy to be leaving, actually, but he's waving goodbye to the Mir. He was up for a total of 115 days by the time we brought them back down. Here's the Soyuz redocking. To the left side of the picture, you can see the Soyuz closing in and contacting the module, the Kavant 1 module on the very left side of the picture. They had a problem. They were supposed to stay undocked for about another 15 minutes, and we'd maneuver up to a better position to take video of them as they redocked. But the computer failed on the Mir, and the Mir lost attitude control and started to drift out of attitude. And Mission Control Moscow said, if you want to get back on the Mir, redock right now. And he did, because their only recourse, due to limited electrical power on the Soyuz, would have been to deorbit within the next 2 hours. So they had to hurry up and redock, and Anatoly did a beautiful job, and this is them back on board the Mir. I mentioned that we flew around them for an orbit and a half, and we shot some of this imagery and some still pictures of them as we were leaving. And then we stayed in orbit for another 2 days to get some more testing and some more preconditioning on the cosmonauts and on Norm Thagard, who had been up for the long duration time. We also did a little bit of conditioning ourselves. I wanted to get exercise every day while I was up there because it just makes it that much easier on you when you come back down and land. And I think I got to ride on the bicycle ergometer something like 6 out of the 10 days that we were up there. We had some special seats that Ellen and Greg are setting up on the floor of the middeck, and these are recumbent seats so that the 3 long-duration astronauts could come back into Earth lying down. So they were physically lying flat on the floor with their knees up and their feet in a couple of the lockers as we came back down to land. And this is a shot of us coming back in. We had a couple rain showers and a couple of clouds that moved into our way, and so we wound up shooting a little bit of an approach through the clouds. And again, we're about a 229,000-pound glider at this point. Coming back into land, our approach speed is 300 miles an hour until we go into this flare maneuver, and then in the flare maneuver we slow down to about 210 for touchdown. And you probably noticed we hold the landing gear until we're 300 feet above the ground. That's because the orbiter glides like kind of a smooth brick with the gear up and kind of like a bumpy brick with the gear down. And that drag parachute, we pop that out right as we start to bring the nose down. And you'll see the cover for the door, or the door itself, the door for the drag parachute is going to take off to the left here. Everybody wants to know what's that piece that came off the orbiter. That's the drag chute door, and that's normal. That's supposed to do that. And again, we rolled to a stop on the runway 15 at the Kennedy Space Center. That's the 3rd time that I've landed down at Kennedy. I've landed at Edwards twice, and I've landed at Kennedy 3 times. And right now, I'm the only person who's landed 4 space shuttles, although probably at some point we're going to have somebody else who's flown as commander 4 times. Okay, that's what the flight looked like. As I mentioned, it's a flight that looks very much like what an International Space Station docking flight will look like in the years ahead. I never would have dared to dream before the flight that it would come off as well as it did, that all of the coordination with Mission Control Moscow and Mission Control Houston would work as well as it did, and that the machinery would hold together. I think we had a total of 4 anomalies on the orbiter the whole time that we were up in space, and any little malfunctions would have had the effect of dragging us to our knees because we had such a busy timeline the time that we were up there. And so we had an awful lot of luck go our way. We had an awful lot of good work that got done both ahead of time leading up to the mission, and an awful lot of good work that a lot of people down here on the ground did to make sure that everything worked so well. You know, I complained about the complete rewrite of the undocking plan, but the guys down in Mission Control were up all night working that thing with Mission Control Moscow and coordinating it and putting together that 20 pages that they sent up to us. And of course we had to cut it out and put it in our books. They had to stay up all night developing it. So an awful lot of hard work went into the flight. We're due to launch the next one in October, and I'm looking forward to the same kind of success out of that one, because we have a talented crew that's going to go do that mission. And then again, we'll have 5 more of those in the years ahead, leading us eventually into International Space Station. I think probably both sides in this whole deal, the Russians and the Americans, got kind of dragged into this whole thing kicking and screaming. And now that we've gotten there, we're looking around and we're saying maybe this isn't such a bad thing after all. The Russians certainly bring something to the table. They bring a long-duration orbiting station, a vehicle that's been up there for 9 years so far. They obviously know how to do that part of it. We bring to it a pretty good delivery truck. Space Shuttle, even today, 14 years after it first flew, is the only vehicle in the world that can launch and carry that kind of payload to orbit and bring things back down again. So we can be a resupply and a scientific sample return vehicle. So we have the delivery truck. They have the remote orbiting station in space. We very nicely complement each other's capabilities. So again, we got dragged into it kicking and screaming. Maybe it's not so bad now that we're there. Pat, I think at that point I will quit and see if there's any questions. Do we still have time for some questions?
Yeah.
We do. Okay, well, if we haven't, I know I covered it so well, there probably aren't hardly any questions, but yes, sir.
What is the sensation when you get gravity back on your body? What does it feel like?
It's really depressing. You know, as you could see in the movie, some of those caves that we floated through would have been really difficult to walk through. In fact, we trained in those sort of things over in Moscow. They have a mock-up of the Mir Space Station, and it is really awkward and difficult to crawl down those little corridors and climb over all those things. It's so nice just to fly everywhere that you go. When you come back down and land, you hit the atmosphere rather gradually, and so the G's don't slam into you when you come back down, but they build up very gradually, and you see about 2 times the force of gravity during the re-entry. And like I say, it feels really depressing. When you get back down on the ground and roll to a stop, you weigh what you did before you launched, but you've had 10 days to forget what that felt like. And as a result, you feel like you weigh about 300 pounds when you get back down. You try to fly again, and you can't fly anymore. And so it's really depressing to come back. Yes, sir.
How do you run a treadmill in 0G?
That's a good question. What we have is we have a harness that you put on, and then there's a system of bungees which are adjustable, and you can set the load on the bungees, and the bungees actually physically hold you down against the treadmill. And then the treadmill itself, one of them's electric, and I don't know how you get any exercise running on an electric treadmill where it's running itself around, but one of them, you have to provide all the force to move the belt, and I think that's the better of the two, because you do get some pretty good exercise. I really like the ergometer, because the bicycle ergometer, because it's very quiet and you can set a known wattage and ride at a particular wattage, like 200 watts, for example. And the bicycle is real quiet, doesn't make a lot of noise. The treadmill makes an awful lot of racket, and it's hard to do anything else back in the laboratory when the treadmill is going because it makes so much noise. Yes, ma'am.
You said Dr. Thagard lost 11% of his bone mass. Has he regained that, and if so, how?
I don't know the answer to that yet, and we're thinking that it's going to be, conceivably, it took him 115 days to lose that bone mass. It may take him 115 days to get it back. He was going downtown Houston yesterday for his second MRI since he got back, and so I don't know the answer yet. We will know that answer, and then, you know, we're going to have another question. Even if he gets back the calcium, if the calcium apparently comes back, does it come back in the right form? Is it in the right crystal structure? Is it in the right places? And I don't know how we're going to find that out. It's been suggested a bone biopsy would find it out, but he's not eager to participate in that. So I'm not sure if we'll be able to get that answer. Yes, sir.
Russian up into a year or more. I guess affects something. Tremendous loss of calcium.
Question is, the Russians have been up for a year or more, and do they suffer from that loss of calcium? We believe they do. We believe they do. And if we ask them that question, they don't know the answer. They don't know how much calcium they lose. They don't know if it recovers. Since they don't know how much they lost, they don't know if it recovers normally. And they kind of look at the person and say, well, he's back and he's walking okay, so he must be all right. You know, we used to get answers out of them that we don't have any trouble with it, and this just proves that communism is better than capitalism. We used to get that sort of thing, but not anymore. They don't have any of that kind of hard medical data, and I expect that we will share quite a bit of it with them, because this has been a great opportunity for us to learn things from their guys too. We got to do a lot of blood work. The Russians didn't let us do MRIs on them because they didn't really understand an MRI. So when they got back down on the ground, they politely refused to take part in the MRI, and we were counting on getting more than one data sample out of this mission, but they weren't willing to do an MRI when they got back.
What kind of a vehicle do the Russians have to launch cosmonauts into space and dock into the space station?
The question is, what kind of launch vehicle do they have? Their launch vehicle is actually called the Soyuz, and we saw the Soyuz capsule, which is the inhabited part of it, and the little capsule with the habitation module is the part that makes it to orbit. The booster itself is also called a Soyuz, and it's kind of a 1.5 stage vehicle. It has a central core engine that runs all the way to orbit, and then it has 4 strap-on liquid fuel. They're all liquid fuel motors. It has 4 strap-on boosters that burn for something like 2.5 minutes, and then they drop off, and then the central core takes them all the rest of the way to orbit. It's kind of interesting because we trained in it over in Moscow, and where an awful lot of the things that we do in the shuttle are presented by the computer and we have to approve them, and there's a lot of manual intervention and a lot of manual control on the shuttle. On the Soyuz, you don't even know when it's about to do a burn. It's all automatic, and I was sitting in the simulator and I said, we've got a burn coming up, don't we? To the instructor, and the instructor says, yes, the burn is coming up here within the next couple of minutes. I said, when's it going to happen? He said, I don't know. And I said, well, how do you monitor it? How do you tell? And he said, you can't. And there's not a timer counting down to it. There's not a display of your orbital parameters, your apogee and your perigee, because you'd be able to surmise when the burn was going to happen based on those. There's no way you can tell. The only way you can tell, this little yellow light comes on about 2 seconds before the motors ignite, and all of a sudden the motors are going and off you go. And that'd be a real surprise if you were floating out of your seat, and all of a sudden that little yellow light comes on. You're going to want to grab a hold of something. But it's an interesting vehicle. It's essentially the same vehicle that Yuri Gagarin launched to space in 1961. They haven't changed it a whole lot because it works. Well, it comes back down the way that the Apollos used to come down, with a braking parachute. So they do a deorbit burn that puts you on a flight path down into the atmosphere, and then you fly what's called a ballistic re-entry. They don't have any wings, so they tumble into the atmosphere, or not tumble, they fall into the atmosphere. The heat shield absorbs all the heat and the temperature of re-entry, and then at a predicted point they pop out their parachutes. There's probably no way to monitor that either, to tell when the parachutes are going to come out. The parachutes come out, and it comes down on dry land. They cannot land in the water because they have no flotation. So they always have to deorbit to dry land, and they deorbit to Kazakhstan, to the vast steppes of the big plains of Kazakhstan. And at about 7 feet above the ground, there's a rocket on the capsule that at about 7 feet above the ground, it senses the ground coming up and it fires this braking rocket to slow it down. And then inside they have spring-loaded seats that they're sitting in, and when the thing hits, the springs take up all the impact when the thing hits the ground. And you'd say, well, it'd be a lot softer if you brought it down in the water, and it's true, but they don't have any flotation on it, so you can't do that. So it sounds, in many ways, it sounds kind of simplistic and crude to us, but again, it works, and it worked since 1961, so why change it? Yes, ma'am. No, they can't reuse it. It's a one-shot vehicle. Sorry? Question is, do I think that the lack of changes is due to their financial condition? Well, nowadays that might be true because they really are strapped for money. They really are in difficult economic straits, but they have a philosophy, and it's something like better is the mortal enemy of good enough. And so all these years where well, let's see, how do I put it without getting in trouble? All these years that they've had a communist government over there that didn't have to answer to anybody for where they spent money, that could just do whatever they wanted with resources, they've had the wherewithal many, many times over the years to change things if they wanted to, but they haven't wanted to. Because again, it worked okay, so that's right. If it isn't broke, don't fix it. Way in the back.
You said we provided them with water that was a byproduct of electricity production, and I was wondering if they did it another way. Did they get water as a byproduct of their electricity, or did they do it a different way?
No, actually, the way they generate electricity is with their solar cells, the big solar wings that you saw out there, and I'll tell you how they get oxygen. One way they get oxygen. The solar cells are kind of interesting because that's free electricity. You know, you make all those solar cells, and we've all got some of those because we've all got those little calculators that have got a light sensing solar cell, and that gives you enough electricity to run your little calculator. Trouble is, when you put one out there staring at the sun for 9 years, the solar cell loses large percentages of its output. And so if you put one up that's good for 10 kilowatts back in 1986, by now it's probably only good for about 6 kilowatts because the sun's ultraviolet rays eventually destroy your solar cells. So one of the big things that they are lacking on the Mir Space Station is electrical power. Well, that's a real problem because the way they generate electricity is backwards from the way we do it. They take this vast supply of electrical power that they used to have back in 1986, and they break down water, and they break down water through electrolysis. They break down water, and that produces hydrogen and oxygen. They dump the hydrogen overboard, and they use the oxygen on board. Well, that's a real problem if you don't have all this vast electrical power anymore, which they don't. So you can't use the electrolysis thing. So what they do is they've got these things on board that they call candles. And I don't know if any of you have used this solid-ox system for welding. You can generate oxygen by lighting this cartridge, and it smolders. It looks like a big cigar burning, and it releases oxygen. Well, they burn 1 candle per person per day on board the Mir Space Station. So their Progress resupply modules, when they come up, they bring them up a whole bunch of these candles, and they put this thing out in this big candle holder in the Mir core module, and they light it on fire, and they burn this thing in the Mir core module. It burns, I say burns, it smolders. It smolders at a temperature of about 1200, 1400 degrees, and it releases oxygen into the cabin. So that's how they generate oxygen. So they do it backwards from the way we do it. They really can't make water because you've got to keep liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen up there for year after year after year, and that stuff won't stay. It'll just boil away. So water, therefore, is a very priceless commodity to them, and we should have sold it to them. We should have at least got some vodka, from the flight. Yes, sir.
Was it that big a deal about defeating Russian Mir halfway through the tunnel on the inside of the tunnel?
I'm not sure. I still want to ask him how come we. How do I put it? We had a little bit of difficulty arriving at exactly where we were going to shake hands, and we actually cut some of the video out here because it took a long time for him to reach across and take my hand. And the Russians have a tradition, and we had studied all of this. The Russians have a tradition that when you go to a Russian home, it's bad luck to shake hands across the threshold. So when a Russian in his home opens the door, you don't reach your hand across to shake his hand because that's bad luck. You step into the house and then you shake his hand. And I think that might be what Volodya was doing. He was making me come all the way across into the Russian side before he would shake my hand, because they really are kind of superstitious. They have these funny things that they do. When you go to launch on a Russian rocket, you may have heard about this, there's a tradition, and Yuri Gagarin, as he was on his way to the launch pad, had to go to the bathroom. And he was in his spacesuit, he was in the launch van riding out to the pad, and he had them stop the van, and he got out and he weed on the tire. And so now every time there's a Russian launch, I kid you not, and this is male or female crews, they stop the van at exactly the point where Yuri Gagarin stopped the van, and they all get out and they walk back to the rear right tire and they all wee on the tire. And that's because it was good luck. When Yuri Gagarin did it, it was good luck for him, so they do it. So they are kind of superstitious. I kept trying to tell them it's bad luck to be superstitious. Right? Yes, sir.
If they're short of oxygen, how are they maintaining pressure inside their body?
Well, the question is, if they're short on oxygen, how are they maintaining pressure inside? Well, let's see, how do I put this without getting into trouble? They don't maintain their pressure as tightly as we do. When they launched it, it was at sea level pressure. Every time that they do a spacewalk, the way you do a spacewalk, is you have an airlock, which is just like a submarine, and you close it off, and when you're ready to relieve the pressure inside the airlock, you relieve the pressure to vacuum. You just go ahead and dump what's in the airlock to vacuum. Now the airlock is at vacuum. Well, you dump a certain amount of air every time you do it. Well, every time they go out and do a spacewalk, they lose a little bit. So when we got up there, they were at 13 psi. where they started out at 14 psi back last March. They have a very limited supply of air because that has to be carried up. They can't build air on board. And they don't have nitrogen tanks and oxygen tanks the way that we do. So they actually carry up nitrogen and oxygen in tanks, but not liquid nitrogen, not liquid oxygen. So they have a very limited supply of it. So that's one of the other things that we supplied them that I kind of left out when I talked about this. We also repressurized their station for them. By the time we got there, and they had equalized, and we had equalized with them, we were down to like 12.9 psi in the orbiter. And then we got all of our hatches opened up, and we brought everything up to, we took them actually up to 15.1 psi. So we took them higher than sea level pressure. And that was to give them a little bit more air to work with. And after we left, they started bleeding back down again, and they're somewhere in the vicinity of about 13.5 psi even now. So they don't have an unlimited supply of air on the thing, and so they let the pressure fluctuate up and down, where we keep ours right at sea level pressure. Teresa? Yeah, daytime is dark. You can't see the sun at night, and well, no, it's kind of an interesting question because we circle the Earth every 90 minutes, and so obviously you're on the sunlight side of the Earth for 45 minutes and then on the dark side for 45 minutes, so you watch the sun go up and down 16 times a day. So it's a lot of fun taking pictures of sunrises and sunsets, and you've got lots of them to work with. So you ought to be able to get at least one picture of a sunrise or a sunset. I think I'm just about wearing them out. Yes, sir?
Do you know if there's a video or a book that's already out there that's available that we can get on the documented space station?
I don't think there is yet. The video that I've got here is one that we, the crew, put together, and it's just one that we put together a bunch of sequences. NASA, I know, is putting together a video resource. Let's see, what do they call it? It's called the Mission Highlights Resource Tape, and it's about an hour-and-a-half long tape. And if that's not available right now, and I think they provide it to the press and they provide it to educational services and that sort of thing. If it's not available yet, it must be getting pretty close to being available. And then there's usually a post-flight report that gets written, but that's not quite out yet. Especially the one that the crew has to write.
I think we have time for one more question, so make it good.
What are the plans to do with Mir after the International Space Station?
That's a good question. The Mir was, as I mentioned, it was launched in 1986. It was designed to be good for 5 years, and that was nearly 5 years ago now. So it's about doubled its lifetime. I'm pretty sure that what they're going to do once we get International Space Station going is that we have some intelligence that thinks that they're going to build another Mir space station, and they're going to let this one fall in the ocean. Now, I say let it fall in the ocean. They will very carefully drop it in the ocean somewhere that they can make sure that the water's, well, the water wouldn't be clear, but make sure there's no ships or planes in the area. But I really think that they will retire that station, and retire means clear it out of the way and re-enter it. And most of it, or a good portion of it, I think would burn up during re-entry, but they will probably drop it off somewhere, is what they'll do. And then we think they're going to build a Mir 2 in addition to the International Space Station. And again, that's a little bit conjecture on my part, the Mir 2 part of it. We know they're going to build International Space Station, and we have it on good word that they're moving ahead with their own plan for Mir 2. Well, I think I've run you out of time. Thank you very much. I sure enjoyed it. Patty, thanks for letting me back. We're going to even get a standing ovation. That's all right. Thank you.
you very much for coming, and we really appreciated the presentation.
My pleasure.
And I surely hope next time they have tractor beams.
Yeah.
Hold on just a second. I got a little thing I would like to present to you. It's not very much, but it's an anniversary cup for the Monrovia Management Association 25th anniversary.
Oh,
I'd like you to keep that for
that's the
memory.
size I need.
That's the size you need?
Right.
And I'd like to give one to your mom, Rita. And thank you for coming.
Oh, all right. Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Well, we're supposed to take a little break after this, but I think in the interest of time, unless everybody would like to take a break. Actually, let's do it. Let's do it for about 3-4 minutes, and then we're going to do the teammate of the month, and then the raffle tickets. Now, during the break, if anybody hasn't bought any 50-50 raffle tickets, please be sold in the back. The 50-50 raffle is really good for the scholarship and the student awards, so on and so forth.
There's 2 lines there. No, I'm not doing it. Take this home. I'll take a whole thing. I want to tell you a little bit about the oxygen candles. They were invented for the U.S. Navy submarines. They're potassium permanganate, and they're invented by a guy named Robert Bovard, who worked for Mine Safety Appliances. I had the privilege of working with him, and they were also used on this. They're also used on the C-5A and undersea.
Is that right?
Yeah, we built them when I was a U.S. divers.
Well, I know I use some.
I'll send your sister an email note about it tomorrow.
I appreciate it. All right, that's great. My pleasure. Thank you. Good meeting you.
I'll send her a note about it tomorrow. Keep writing.
Sure.
I won't ask you to specialize.
Oh, okay. Do sign.